This is Wild by Nature, stories of human connection to the wild. This is a podcast exploring how nature, ancient wisdom and lived experience guide us back to purpose, balance and belonging. I'm your host, Vian Sharif, and if you've ever felt the pull to slow down, reconnect and listen more closely to the world around you, you're in the right place. Welcome to Wild by Nature, stories of human connection to the wild. I'm your host, Vian Sharif, and today we're talking about something incredibly powerful, our relationship with nature and why the natural world may be the most valuable thing on Earth, even though we often take it for granted. Joining us is Jenna Nicholas. Jenna is an investor who works to move money towards solutions that work in harmony with society and our shared home, our planet. Through her work and through time spent with Indigenous communities, she's been exploring an important idea that the people who have lived closest to nature for generations may have some of the most important lessons about how to protect it. She's recently launched her book, The Enlightened Bottom Line, which explores the intersection of business, spirituality, and investing. Jenna, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'd love to start with something personal. Was there ever a moment in nature, a place or experience that made you see the natural world differently in your own worldview?
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be in this conversation today. There's been a number. I think one that really comes to mind is actually just last summer, I had the opportunity to go to the Amazon with an incredible organization called Pachamama Alliance. And they've been leading these trips to the Amazon over the last 30 years. This is the Ecuadorian Amazon. And we were spending time with the Achuara and Sapara communities. And we had a chance each day that we were there to really spend time deeply in the forest. And we had a number of exercises that we did where we would kind of forest bathe and she just lie down and soak up everything that the forest was there to teach us. And the sounds of the birds and the feeling of the leaves against our body, I mean, it really, I think, transported me to another place and I think helped me to reassess our relationship to nature and what that means in terms of who we are and how we're showing up in the world.
I think that's also a Japanese concept of forest bathing. I think that's something that I've heard spoken about. And often there's this moment when experiencing nature in that way, especially wild nature, that people can remember that changed everything for them. And was there anything like that in your past, especially given your faith, that did that for you?
I did actually. Growing up, I took part in this program called Transformation for Peace. And it was with young people from all around the world. And it was in the mountains in Switzerland. And I went there from the ages of 12 to 15. And it was inspired by my faith, the Baha'i faith. And I remember the first year I went and I was 12 years old and we were hiking in the mountains. And I remember feeling, I was a pretty moody kid and I came on this program and I was like angry with the world. And I remember just walking one day and just seeing the vastness of these mountains and like that feeling that people often describe of, we are just drops in this broader wilderness. I really felt that in that moment. And I started crying. And I do, to this point about it changing your life, it was the beginning of this journey of, like, how do we think differently, certainly in terms of how we relate to nature, but also what does that mean in terms of how we relate differently to other human beings? And that perhaps in being held by that vastness of nature, it can recalibrate our sense of purpose and why we're here and who we are. And so that was definitely one of my early experiences of that.
For someone who hasn't been to a place like the Amazon, can you share what it was like to experience a place like that? What did it make you realize about why this extraordinary natural resource that we all have is so important?
I think one thing that really helped me to sort of recalibrate how we think about nature is there's in the Achuwa community have a practice of every morning at 5 a.m. of waking up and sitting in a circle and sharing the dreams that they had the night before and making decisions on what they're going to do that day based on the dreams that they had the night before. And often these are decisions as it relates to what they're going to do in nature. So it's, are they going to fish that day? Are they going to hunt? Like what are they going to do? And we had an opportunity to participate in this exercise with the Achua community, and that was a really profound shift for me in thinking that the way that they were talking about their decisions as it related to how they were going to interact with nature was with this deep sense of the interconnectedness between them and nature, and that it wasn't something separate from them, but rather it was almost, if they could create the spaciousness to truly listen to what nature and their dreams were telling them, that they would have a much more profound and meaningful life as a result. But it came so intuitively to them. So that was something that I think helped me to think, oh, what would it look like if we were to adopt practices like that in our lives that can be so busy and so full, that the spaciousness to actually listen to what our dreams or the natural world is really trying to tell us.
I think that's incredibly beautifully put in terms of an example, and you talk about it in your book, this idea that taking the space to reflect, and obviously meditation has been a practice that has been celebrated and starting to flow back into our world, but this idea that actually if you can reconnect back into oneself, into that connection with nature of which we are a part, then could insight and action be informed from that place.
Exactly.
Incredibly powerful. And perhaps the tension between the way that our world that we operate in, the investment community, the financial community, the corporate community, how separate that's become from that space. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that tension?
There's a line from the Baha'i writings that makes me think about, and then I share about this in the book too, and it says, a human being is organic with the world. His or her inner life molds the environment and is deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of a human is a result of these mutual interactions. And I remember first hearing that line when I was about 12 years old, and I remember thinking, this is what a profound idea, that every day, right, we are shaping the environment around us, and we are also being shaped by it. And so when I think about that, to your point, and within the investment management space, I mean, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is, a lot of our work is looking at the $82 trillion of assets under management in the asset management industry, and the fact that less than 2% is invested into women and people of color run companies and funds. And think about, if we're thinking about how are we shaping the environment of the financial system, and also how we're being shaped by it, what does it look like to recalibrate the way that we're engaging with the system? I think the other thought that comes to mind, there's a framework that present in the book called the HEAL framework, so hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. And I think about this concept around abundance, it's interconnected with the idea of enoughness. And I think there's so much that we can learn about through our relationship to nature that can teach us around, like, what does enough really mean? And then when we're thinking about the financial management system, and think about this a lot through the investments that you make, how are we thinking about also this idea of what is the trace that we're trying to leave, and how do we consider that as we're making our investment decisions?
And that leads really beautifully onto this idea of the tension between what successful looks like and wanting to be successful in our lives, and how we have meaning in our lives. So this idea that success and wanting to have meaning, and how we combine those. What are your reflections on those concepts?
So I had the opportunity to work with the Calvert Funds, which has been one of the pioneers in the area of social responsible investing. And the founder of Calvert had this pretty profound experience early on when they were first starting Calvert. They started it just as a money market fund, and he went to a Buddhist retreat, and at the retreat, they had them reflect on, what would it say on your tombstone? And his reflection was, it will say, the man that made 2% more than the next man. And his reflection was, that isn't really the legacy that I want to leave. And so he went back to his team, and that we need to make this socially responsible. And Calvert's now a $45 billion firm, and there's been a pioneer in this whole area of social responsible investing. But it really came from this moment of having this reflection on, to your point, like, what is success? Like, what is the legacy that I want to leave? And so I think that, to this point about how we create this spaciousness, I think nature can really help us to do that. That this recalibration of what we're thinking of as success, and then what does that mean in terms of how we make decisions, from our investments to our broader, business decision making as a result of that.
And that talks to your point around capital flows. And there are many stats, like the stats around how much money is flowing into practices or industries that are not going to sustain our nature as the infrastructure behind how we live and create an economic system, versus the amount that is flowing. And the difference between the two is vast. How do we, do you think, start to bridge that gap? So how do we start to decide to do things differently? Where does that lever come from, do you think?
I think a couple of elements. I think one is the personal transformational shift, with even the recognition of this being an important shift to be made. And one example I'll mention of that is I had an opportunity. So Cristiano Figueres has been bringing together people working in the climate space in collaboration with Plum Village, so Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery in Bordeaux. And I had an opportunity to participate in one of these programs last year. And it was a really profound experience, because it was people from all around the world that are working in different parts of the climate space, some from an investment perspective and activists and others. And a big part of the program was deep meditation and deep reconnection to ourselves and to each other from a deeper space of connecting. And I think some of the ability for us to even have insights on how we might shape the investment landscape differently can come from a place like that. Like, certainly I found, just taking part in this program 8 days, that the insights that emerged in sort of taking a step back was so profound that I think if I'd spent 8 days trying to struggle through a problem, that it would have been so much less effective. So I think that's one element, is what is that deep personal work that we're doing, and personal work with individually and collectively, to be able to tune into a greater source of insight than we may otherwise be able to. And then I think about, like, what are the organizational shifts that can come from that space. And there's some research that I mentioned in the book that came from Dr. Ashby Monk at Stanford, who has done a lot of work actually on the role of mindfulness in debiasing the investment decision-making process. So even something as simple as taking a pause before we make an investment decision, how much more effective that decision can be as a result. So I know a lot of boards have started to have board representatives of people who are representing nature on their board. And so the idea that, how are we actually elevating the role of nature within our decision-making processes?
It's extraordinary to think of that presence on around a boardroom table. We've seen it in Client Earth. We've seen it in a number of different ways. You even talked about Charlie Munger having a decision to step back from his own biases and taking that time and that space.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's huge. Just coming back to your experiences in nature, often people say that when they spend time in wild nature, they, and even a quiet park, we heard this through the COVID experience, that they feel calmer or they see things more clearly, and that enables them to move to a space of different perspective. And do you have any sense, or could you share with us why you think nature affects us in that way?
One story I want to share, as you were saying about spending time in the park. Growing up, my grandmother was an artist, and growing up, we would both go to the park often, and we would sketch like ducks and sketch the lake, and I think that it was a perfect example of what you're describing, in terms of just by being so deeply present to everything that was going on around us. And it helped me certainly, and I think cultivating that at an early age, I feel deeply grateful for, of being so aware of, and Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this a lot, of like, what is the drops dripping from a leaf? And I think so often we don't spend the time to notice those details. Like, we're so focused on, getting to the next meeting and the kind of constant flow of life. But I think that there's something about nature that enables us to, if we allow it, to slow us down and to see things more clearly. I certainly find every time I'm swimming in an ocean, right, like there's to this point about embracing that vastness, that it enables us to both see this nature that is within us, but also to be able to then have a fresh perspective in how we engage with the decisions that we're making, with the people around us, with our investments. And so I think that there's something about the more that we can invest that time in stepping back and stepping into nature, pretty profound shifts that can take place as a result.
And perhaps if we just look at the flip side of that, as a VC investor, you're engaging with all sorts of founders, all sorts of leaders, and all sorts of businesses. And so what happens when that connection isn't there? So we've talked about firms which have had that very profoundly at their heart, Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, and Calvert, and so on. What happens when that is lost, and what have you observed?
I think that there's fundamentally that these sort of models of like more of an extractive way of engaging with certainly nature, but also just building businesses, and then more of a regenerative way of building businesses and engaging with the world. And I think so many of the challenges that we see right now, certainly in the way businesses are built, but the impact on the environment comes from this more extractive way of being. And part of my previous work was building a coalition of 170 foundations, about $50 billion in assets under management, that were shifting capital from fossil fuels and into new economy solutions. And I think when we think about, certainly the fossil fuel industry is a great example of this, but it's not exclusive to the fossil fuel industry, but that like business models that are, fundamentally based on exactly the opposite of everything that we're talking about, right? Where it's this sense of nature is here to serve us rather than we are interconnected with nature. And so I think it is such an important one to recognize like so many of these models of how business is done. And I remember spending time with a mining company in Peru, and they showed me the gold mining site, and I was like, "Oh, what made you choose to mine here rather than the mountain next door?" And they said, "Well, the local community thinks that this mountain is sacred, but they're coming around." I was like, "What?" And he said it without, there was no sense that maybe that may not be the most nice way to engage with things. And so I think that there is that's why I think this interconnection between inner transformation and the outer work is such an important aspect of this, because our inability to see both like people's humanity, but also the fullness and vastness of nature has a direct impact on the business models that we're designing.
It's interesting, especially as we transition into a different kind of world.
Mm.
This knowledge, you've just given an example, the sacred mountain. Indigenous communities have remembered that connection, and they continue to remember it. Why do you think, from your experience, that they've been so successful in protecting the environment in which they live? And perhaps how can we start to bring some of that remembering back into what we do?
I know this is a big part of your work, but I'm really drawn to the deep indigenous wisdom around the idea of thinking through a 7 generations mindset. And I think so much of the relationship to nature that is so built into so many indigenous communities is the 7 generations mindset of like how, when we're making decisions, are we looking at that from the perspective of considering 7 generations in the past and the impact on 7 generations into the future. And so if we're thinking about the impact on our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren, like that's a fundamentally different perspective than public companies that are on these quarterly investment decision-making process or business decision-making processes. And so something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is, what does it look like to hold that 7 generations mindset and still need to make decisions today and for this week and for this month? And so I think that ability to hold that much longer time horizon and how that then translates into still our monthly and quarterly metrics is such an important aspect of engaging around this topic.
What comes to mind for me is this idea of being custodians of what we have today for the next generation. And I recall a Joseph Campbell quote when he talks in The Power of Myth about the encounter between the indigenous Americans and then the people coming in, and they were talking about land ownership. And the indigenous perspective was, how can you own this land? We're just here to take care of it for the next generation. How can you own this air? How do we own the air? And so it's an interesting concept to think of that in the way that we position ourselves when we're thinking about investment decisions, because these can be very large when we're talking about billions of dollars, trillions of dollars now, a capital system that really flows through everything that we do, has become critical to how we function in our world. And yet, how much of that is being influenced by some of the thinking that you're now starting to bring to the fore, which arguably, I don't know if we could have had this conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Any perspectives on that?
Well, 100%. I think there's a concept in the Baha'i writings around the forces of disintegration and integration in the world and the interplay between the two. And I think so much of what we're seeing, and it certainly feels like it's come to a fore in the last 5 years, more so than even previously, are these forces of disintegration, right? Every day what we're seeing in the media, certainly as it relates to nature, but just broader political and social and economic strife. I think the receptivity that then leads to in terms of people engaging and wanting to build towards these forces of integration is that much more on people's mind. And so, this framework in the book around hope and empathy and abundance and legacy, like this sense of the cognitive behavioral process of hope, and that it not being just this wishful idea, but Brené Brown talks about the idea of like microdosing hope. And I think that with things being as bad as they are, the desire from people to be able to engage around where are these sources of hope. And I think coming back to nature, there's so much that we can learn from nature in terms of this cultivation of hope.
I want to just dig into that a little bit more, the framework, because it's a key part of how you present the path to change, perhaps, in the book. How do you think that choosing abundance over scarcity, hope over its opposite, changes the way people actually act in business?
It's been really interesting to see how different companies are integrating some of these concepts. And, one example that I'll share, it's a company called Devoted Health. It's a company that's been very successful in the healthcare space. And they have this practice of, before they make any decision or before they engage with any of the patients that they work with, they're encouraged as healthcare providers to close their eyes and imagine that the patient they're about to interact with is a beloved family member. And they credit so much of their success as an organization to this simple exercise of just closing your eyes and imagining that this person you're interacting with is a beloved family member. And I think about that also again in the context of nature, is that when we can deeply sense into our interconnectedness with nature and with each other, I think that the business decisions that we make, the investment decisions that we make, that much more effective as a result. And I think that so much of that comes from, like, certainly the hope as a source of even believing that that is possible, right? I think that there's so much in the world that and lead us to believe that that's not possible and that we are separate, and that there's so much that is teaching us about separation, that our ability to overcome those forces of separation to see more of what connects us than divides us. And I think that more of an abundant mindset also enables us to be able to do that.
And Jenna, you've been in this space thinking about these concepts for a long time. What inspired you to finally write this book?
I kept having conversations with different investors and business leaders, and I kept hearing this line that they would say, which is, I don't really feel like I can talk about it, but. And then they would share, and they often were experiences in nature or experiences of this deep connection to something greater than themselves that became a fuel for so much of the work that they were engaging in. And a big part of the question that led to for me was, what would it look like if we were to lower the barriers to entry to have conversations like the one we're having today, right? That enables us to be able to think differently about who we are and why we're here, and how could that potentially be inspiring to other people who are looking to build businesses and investment practices that want to be more deeply grounded and connected to who we are as human beings.
I love what you said about fuel.
Mm,
What's the fuel that drives us? And this idea, I mean, certainly for some leaders who are very focused on the mission around nature preservation, it is a fuel that gives you the energy to continue and provides you with a path to walk down to achieve your mission.
mm,
So we're, in a way, thinking about how that fuel is recalibrated, realigned, and just interested in your perspectives on what you've heard from leaders, how that driving force that enables you to build a business, that enables you to keep going, that means that, well, it means that you have meaning.
No, I hear that consistently, and I think that actually it is that the number of leaders talked about when they find themselves in more of a scarce, fear-based mindset, that going and taking a walk in nature, like being immersed in the vastness of the trees, and that then enables them to come back to trying to solve the business problems that they're trying to solve with this fresh perspective. So I think that whether it is spending time in nature or other practices that people cultivate to we can get so caught in our minds and the narratives in our minds. And there's a one of the companies I talk about in the book, they have a practice, they call them like checking our paranoid fantasies, right? And it's we can build these narratives based on interactions that we have, that our ability to actually rethink about like what we're actually trying to build. And I think we need to be drawing on sources of inspiration and energy that's thinking outside the box. And so our ability to call on the inspiration of nature to do that is certainly something I saw pretty consistently across many of the leaders I interviewed.
And you've also talked about the concept of business being a vehicle for healing,
Mm.
potentially. For those of us and who are listening and want their work to matter, what does it look like if you wanted to build a business that is a vehicle for healing nature or the environment around us?
Mm. I think, one thing I have in the book is at the end of each chapter, a series of prompt questions that, with the idea to exactly as you're talking about, that, there's, Rilke has this beautiful line where he talks about the power of holding questions, and that it's so much we can be so focused on trying to find the answers. And some of it actually is how we creating the opportunity to hold the questions. And I think that this question is something that I think sometimes when we're building businesses, so we need to work all this out and then that we stick with it. And I think actually part of it is, and I think we see this with nature, is the constant iteration and this process of action and reflection and action and reflection is how do we see to this point about businesses being sources of healing, but also learning laboratories. I think about a lot of like businesses being dojos for practicing trying to implement so many of these principles that we're talking about. So I think no matter what sector, industry the businesses are in, being able to engage with them from this perspective of we have this thesis that we're testing, and how are we asking these questions constantly around, is this a source of healing? And how in the way I'm engaging with my customers, my suppliers, my partners, uh, continually bringing that to the fore.
Let's just to finish off. If we were to talk about one of the big ideas behind our conversation today, which is that nature might be one of the most undervalued assets on Earth, and that we are indeed part of it. When we think about the economy and we think about business, we think about money or technology, really, we're not necessarily thinking about where nature fits into that. But if you were to explain that to our listeners, our community, fundamentally, how does nature actually support our economy in ways that people might not understand?
In every way, right? And I think that's the piece, right? Is that the us even having this conversation today, and obviously the chairs that we're in, the clothes that we're wearing, right? Like every single aspect of our economy, like, would not be here were it not for the life giving force of nature. And I think that that's like one of our sort of challenges as a society is that we are not so often in our school system, within our work environments, we're not educated around that, and we're not necessarily we're not exposed to the opportunities to be able to reconnect with that reality. And I think that's why you're doing things like spending time in the Amazon and like seeing how some communities, there's such a sense of reverence for nature that I think the more that we can bring that to the fore in the organizations and societies that may not have that as such a core part. And I think about, we talked a little bit about Patagonia, but companies, the structure of the way that they have set themselves up, where the donation of the company, like, to nature, and the setting up of the Hold Fast Collective to be able to literally be holding the company in trust for nature. I think there's so much that we can learn from the way that they have structured that I hope, and actually some of the work I've been doing with some companies, is to try to do similar things and to learn from that model. That um there's obviously very different than I think how so many companies that are set up of wanting to continually build wealth as an end in and of itself, as opposed to thinking about wealth and capital as actually something that's in circulation.
Well, just a follow-on question from that, which is, it. These are examples. So the Patagonia in trust to the Earth example is a perfect case study of how something could be done differently and practically by a business or a founding team or an investment team to structure things differently. If businesses and investors did start recognizing the true value of nature, what do you think could change? Is it structures like this, for example, or others?
Definitely. I think that there's what's been really exciting, and I think Patagonia has been a big part of the inspiration for other companies to do so, is having more innovative business models with employee ownership and sort of collective ownership structures that enable both more of a role for nature, but also just more of a role for more distributed wealth building opportunities than it being purely in the hands of a few at the top. I think that we will see an ability to design organizations that are really built with this sense of, in their DNA is the idea of this interconnection with nature, such that it's not something, I think, that sometimes where the idea can be like, oh, let's just build as much money as possible and then let's think about giving back. And instead, actually, how are we, from the beginning of organizations being built, thinking about so many of these elements, and so it does feel like there's a shift that is taking place that is not just let's extract and then give. It's like, actually, how are we along the way building these interconnected systems.
And you go into a number of examples, very specific examples about these structures in the book itself, which is perfect for those who are trying to imagine a different system, look at different models, and perceive how actually one could change things in our practical lives. And if I think about the purpose of the book, what is the one thing you hope readers take away from it?
My hope is really that we create more spaces like for conversations like this, and that we have this opportunity, and that readers, feel an invitation to align more deeply their personal values with the organizations that they're part of, to be more interconnected with nature in the way that they're designing and building organizations, and that 10 years from now we see a fundamental shift in the economy that has come from that place.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Before we wrap up, I'd love to ask just one final question, and that is, if listeners could change just one thing about their relationship with nature after hearing this conversation, what would it be?
I think it's remembering that it's your friend, and that it's there. There's many books that have been written about how trees communicate with each other and sort of mycelium networks. That I think it's when engaging with nature, engaging with from the perspective of it's there to teach us, and that if we can quieten our minds enough, maybe we can listen to it.
Jenna, thank you so much for joining us today. If people want to get hold of the book, how do they do that?
So on my website, jenna-nicholas.com, there's links to the website, and it's available in bookstores and Amazon and anywhere where you like to buy your books. And so thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm so delighted to have Jenna here. She's usually on the other side of the world and happened to be in London today. So what an absolute joy to have you. Links to where you can find the book will be in the show notes. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for listening to Wild by Nature. If today's conversation sparked reflection, grounded you, or reminded you of what matters, take a moment to stay connected. Follow Wild by Nature on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join me as we continue exploring what it means to live in relationship with the earth and with each other. We'll see you next time.